Hello, everyone. Welcome to Take Charge of Your Health and to our last meeting of the Mental Health Month of June. As I mentioned yesterday, we're planning to have another one in October, so stay tuned for announcements. The scheduled live links can be found on YouTube, and we will announce them on Signal and Facebook as well. We also post videos on Rumble. I'm your host, Sosa Stojkovic, and today we have an interview with Jenifer Skues. So you're welcome to send us your mental health questions, post them in the chat section, and we will try to address them as time allows. Again, information about our ministry and our guest presenter is in the description box and in the chat section. We have free handouts for those who have joined us, and if you are watching the recording, please email us on takechargeofyourhealth101@gmail.com to request today's handouts. In yesterday's meeting with Jenifer Skues, we talked about depression, stress, anxiety, healthy emotional balance, EQ and IQ, and other aspects of mental health, the background of those mental health issues. And Jenifer suggested some very useful practical tips to overcome or control these issues. As we discussed once more, the knowledge we have today and the science behind it are all backed up by the Bible and the spirit of prophecy written many years ago. To further expand on today's interview and to learn more about our guest presenter, please make sure you check out Jenifer's presentation, Getting Off the Emotional Roller Coaster. Welcome back, Jenifer. Thank you very much for being back with us to share more.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure there's some good questions we can discuss.
Yes, absolutely. So we talked yesterday, we talked about different aspects of mental health, and you suggested the reasons and how we can recover from these problems. So
Yes.
Let's talk more about all those different aspects separately, perhaps, shall we?
We can. So I know you've got some questions you'd like to ask me.
Yeah, definitely. So we had questions from our viewers and we have questions ourselves, and that we would like to expand on the topics that we touched on yesterday. So let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll get into the questions.
Okay, very good.
Dear Lord, thank you so much again for bringing us together. Thank you for another opportunity to learn about mental health and to learn about how we can take charge of our mental health and with obedience to your word and your will, that we can be healthy mentally and physically. Thank you so much again, and we ask all these in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. So we talked about stress, anxiety, and how they've been on the rise with these restrictions and rules. And our previous presenter actually talked a little bit about that, how they have actually been on the rise. So, Jenifer, what do you say? Is it because of the social media, because we hear about these things more often, or these issues have actually been on the rise, even domestic violence, anger, depression, anxiety, all of that?
What's happening, particularly with this pandemic and the vaccinations and mandates, it's causing a lot of distress. It's very multifaceted because you're looking at people losing income, not being able to work, choosing options that are going to potentially damage their health, which is very stressful. as well as what's going on at the moment, like with food, what we call food shortages on shelves, looking at other people around you are highly stressed. We had all that isolation for a long time. And then the media saturates us with all that's going on and does a lot of fear orientation. And the governments do too. We're getting things like, well, this monkeypox is on the rise and it's going to be really damaging, and yet we hear conflicting results. So what do you believe? Then we hear, well, it's not such a bad thing and it's not that bad. So people don't know what to believe. They get very confused. They're very stressed about really what's going on in their life. So it's not a simple solution of let's put in a stress management technique. It's something that people have to make decisions about. For example, I've decided not to watch a lot of the media as such. If I want to know something, I'll go online and Google it and read it versus hearing all the hype that goes with it and make an informed decision. So there's things that we can do that help reduce the stress. If not, we believe everything we hear. And good example, I had a friend, she'd arrive here going, oh, it's terrible, you know, you heard the news and guess what's going on now, and you know, if you don't do this you're going to die, and if you do this you're going to die. And it was really, I had to ask her not to do it, arrive and let's just enjoy some time together without doing all that, because it was distressing her. She was quite stressed. So that's the sort of thing that goes on. So that's why you can't just pinpoint one thing. It's different things for different people. I can't hear.
I was muted. So I told my husband one time, sorry, it's a bit windy here, so I try to mute myself whenever I can. And we can hear it. So yeah, I told my husband one time, I said, these things that you hear on the news, because he was telling me all the things that might happen, might not happen. I said, well, these things might happen and they might also not happen. So why stress over them?
Well, there are a few things that came up in our, you know, in the presentation I did yesterday, and one of them is that saying by Mark Twain, I've been through some terrible things in my life and some of them actually happened. And it's the same with this. We're fearing the worst, but it doesn't mean the worst will happen. And that projection ahead causes a lot of anxiety. And you can use all the stress management tools you like, but until the brain or the mind says, no, I'm not going to get upset about it, I'll just get through today and do the best I can. It keeps changing. You know, when you have a look at the moment, mandates are being lifted, people can go back to work, but people are living in fear of isolation again. So I think, well, what's the point of spending every day doing that? So this is where what we think is very powerful. And so we have to harness the mind and be able to stop focusing on all the hype and all that's going on and get on with our day and do the best we can. And to do that means you've got to wind the system down. And we looked at the nervous system, putting the brake on the autonomic nervous system and doing things, well, certainly spiritually. A spiritual focus is, I think, our most powerful tool. With prayer or meditation, studying the word and finding out, particularly with prophecy, because it's giving a bit different story to what we're hearing on the news all the time, you know, that how the world will end. Well, we know that that's not true. So getting truth is very powerful for the mind to comprehend things and put them in perspective. So it's bringing the adrenaline down, that fight flight, and that's a normal response when you think there's a threat of some sort. So it's understanding that and doing the tools. And then we worked on the breathing, of being able to use the heart focus breathing and calming the heart down, because that helps to reset the brain and bring us back to the present. We have to live in the present. I think that's a key element. Catch the brain going ahead or going back over things, because that's what's so stressful.
And it does work, actually. I found it on myself. I used to have conversations and arguments in my head with people, and then I would find that I started having chest pains. And then recently I realized I managed to stop myself before I get to that stage. So it does work, and the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah, it's using the tool. I call it the toolkit, using the toolkit. And there's lots of good things we can do. And that's why if people are watching and haven't listened to the presentation I did last night, then I suggest they do, because it was very practically oriented, gave good insight, and gave you some good tools to help reduce stress levels. And when the brain understands things, then it works a lot smarter. And that's scientific. Science has said when the brain understands how it works smarter. So I teach people how the brain works, and they work smarter. It works. So it's harnessing all that and being able, as I said, to stay focused. If not, because once you project ahead, and this is what you would have been doing if you had that tight chest, your breathing rate changes, your heart rate changes, and you can actually go into have a panic attack, or at least be highly anxious. And there are two different aspects of that. And when you're very anxious, it's important to do some deep, slow breathing, even breathing. But when you are having a panic attack, what's happening, you're doing what's called overbreathing. So that means you're taking in too much oxygen. So you're doing a longer breath in, which loads the oxygen. You can get lightheaded, dizzy, can't cope, and you know something's wrong, and it's quite scary because people wonder, what's wrong with me? Why am I feeling this way? And then what they're doing is doing a short breath out. It's a bit like breathing to the count of 4 in and to the count of 2 out, and then you struggle to breathe, and it's called over breathing. It's like when you blow up a balloon or an airbed, you get really lightheaded and you have to stop and really catch your breath, and it's the same as going into a panic attack. So if you want to mimic a panic attack, do that breathing. And I know doctors who've done that with their patients, have got them to breathe the wrong way, and to show them what a panic attack is. And in that time, doctors used to get them to blow in and out of the paper bag, because what you want to do is stop the input of oxygen, increase the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a natural ventilant. So what it does, it keeps the airways open, and people who have breathing problems often have those puffers if they're with asthma. And all it is, it's chemical ventilant, but it's carbon dioxide does it naturally. So if you teach people to breathe the right way, evenly, about 3 in, 3 out's a good normal breathing rate. If we exercise, we breathe a bit faster. So it depends. When we go to sleep, we breathe a bit slower, but it's an even breathing. But once you start over breathing, and you don't know you're doing it. I've had people in a program I run at times, and they seem fine. They're talking. Next thing, they're having a panic attack. Not because they got anxious, but because they were breathing the wrong way and didn't know it, and you couldn't see it. Some people, they call it hyperventilation. Sometimes you can see people hyperventilating, and I used to see them at where I was working at the psychiatric unit, and their breathing was, they're blowing up that balloon. See the lungs as a balloon, and we'd have to stop them and do that. The best way I find to get back the balance of carbon dioxide, because who wants to carry a paper bag around with them and use that? It's like, if you're out, is to cup your hands. Cup your hands, put it snugly over your mouth and your nose, and then rebreathe, because what you're doing, you're breathing out carbon dioxide and you're breathing it back in. And you'll find very, very quickly that you'll stop going into that panic attack. And it's very frightening because it mimics a heart attack. When people have a full panic attack, eventually they pass out. And that's because the brain says, no, we can't do this. And it's affecting the brain. So the brain will shut everything down and the person will collapse. So the brain can get their breathing going again properly. And that's a pretty scary prospect when people have had a panic attack and then collapse, particularly in public. Then they become phobic, they don't want to go out anymore, they fear having a panic attack. So then they do that future projection, and then they get highly anxious and they don't do things. So you can see how we actually create a problem because we don't understand what the body's doing and what the brain's doing. So, and I've had clients in sessions who gone straight into a panic attack when they might be talking and they remember something and it's very rapid, and you can't get them to go, well, just change your breathing. I get them to do that principle, and within less than a minute, they're back to a normal state. That's how rapid when you put the balance of oxygen, carbon dioxide back in. So it's any listeners out there who have panic attacks, it's the simplest thing to correct through that breathing. If you try taking deep breaths, you get into it more and more because you want to stop the deep breathing and only deep breathe back your carbon dioxide. So
So in that case, because since we're already talking about it, can you just explain to us the differences between panic attack and anxiety attack? Because I have witnessed someone having what I thought was a panic attack, and they actually thought they're having a heart attack, and they even thought they're dying. And I said, no, you're not dying. Don't worry. You're having a panic attack. I was not worried.
They go, I'm dying. I know it's a hard one because they're okay, but they don't. Yeah. Okay. So, with anxiety, anxiety is fear-based, and it'll be worrying. I call it the worrywart syndrome, because people worry a lot and then they feel anxious, and that means they're running on a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, and they're fearing the future. And that's one of the issues now with all these issues with pandemics and storms and floods, and people are just fearing the worst. They keep projecting ahead, so you get highly anxious. Now, the breathing of an anxious person, often they can hold their breath, so they're not breathing, they're holding it in. So getting them to push out and then breathe in and get a deeper breathing going. If they go into hyperventilation, which you can do if the anxiety goes on long enough, then they start to overbreathe. So they're taking a long breath in and a short breath out. Then they go into panic. But panic attacks can occur without anxiety. And it's because it's that balance of oxygen, carbon dioxide. So there is a separation of those, but you can have both together. But often people just have a panic attack, and they say, no, I wasn't anxious. So there's a definite difference between. People who have anxiety attacks tend to isolate, get phobic, stay at home. A good example I often use is if you have been out and you've had panic attacks, particularly in public, and this is what I'm getting back from clients over the years I've worked, that they don't want to go. They become very phobic of shopping centres and shops, and so they do everything to get others to do it for them. But what will happen, say that person gets up in the morning, goes to the fridge, and the milk's nearly gone, and they're going to have a cuppa or breakfast or whatever, and immediately they feel anxious, but they have not connected the dots. Their brain hasn't gone, oh, that's because the milk's gone. What they do is they just go, what's wrong with me? I'm having an anxiety time, and then the anxiety gets worse, and they might register when they pick up the milk and go, oh, I've got to go to the shops, and then it's, oh, what am I going to do? But sometimes they don't. They just stay in this anxiety and they avoid getting milk, or they do things like ring someone to go and get the milk for them. Can you pick up some milk and come round and have a cuppa with me or something? So they find ways of staying home and not having to go and face their fear. Okay. One of the things I do with people who have panic and anxiety, particularly around shopping centres or shops, because we all need to go and buy things. We need to buy food for a start. So I get them to identify the fear and get them to do breathing. And we do that in a session. And then they do an experiential thing of, all I want them to do is go to the mall or wherever they're going to shop. And they don't need to go in. I don't expect that. But I want them to monitor their anxiety and rate it out of 10 when they know they're going to do that task, and on the way and when they get there, and just maybe write down a few thoughts for me, and then do the breathing and calm down and go home again. right? So we do it in stages, and there's a point where they can do that comfortably. Then the next task is, even if they go the next step, so we break it into segments. It might be to go and just do window shopping on the outside, and do the same thing. So it's pairing the thinking and the breathing and the calming to get it back into a rational mode. And that does work very, very well. Again, it's changing the brain, changing the thinking. When you have trauma, because panic is trauma and anxiety is trauma, you have put a massive pathway of information. I call it the freeway in the brain, the trauma freeway or the anxiety freeway. And only one event, particularly with panic, can set up that freeway that becomes a major freeway, and the brain can't stop it. It's like everything fits into that category. So they feed it. It's a feed or starve principle. So they keep feeding the brain with the fear of, oh no, I've got to go to the shops, I've got to get milk or whatever. And that is, so they never get off. So what I do is help people find exit roads. It's like on they've got an LA freeway, if you've ever seen those, which I think most people have. They're incredible and stressful. So you've got to find the exit road, get off the freeway. So I help them find the exit roads, like the breathing, the breaking it into short tasks, because the brain can cope with the short tasks, not the whole problem. So we break it into chunks, get the brain to chunk what they need to do. So there's all these exit roads of doing. We went through a model where we understood beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and actions. And what they're doing is identifying the fear action, or the fear, but the action. But we come back to reprogramming the brain and listen to what they're thinking and check it out, challenge the thinking, find other ways of thinking. And it works. It takes time depending on the individual. Some people do it quicker than others, but it does work.
Yeah, so what if the anxiety is caused by something very simple, like noises, or just something, everyday thing that other people don't pay attention to, and you feel anxious and you feel trapped in that situation? Does the same thing work?
It will, but it's a bit different, because usually if someone can't cope with a noise, and it might be specific types of noises, then usually there is a trauma association from the past, and that can go way back. It can go back to pre-2, where something happened, or noises, or parents fighting, or sudden noises externally. All sorts of things can happen, and the child doesn't remember an event but goes through life with it programmed emotionally. Then something in the present kicks in and it brings up that fear memory or that trauma memory. And then the person associates it with the present, because we said everything's programmed in the 5 senses, which is what we talked about. So the sense of sound is very powerful. A good example is, I know veterans, we used to have them at the clinic when I was working there, and I've got clients I'm treating who are ex-veterans and have trauma, and certain noises are a major trigger. Like for an ex-veteran, if they hear a car backfiring, and this was noted when people came back, soldiers from Vietnam, they would hit the deck. They were back in the war zone because it sounded just like a gunshot. I had a client who thunder is like bombs dropping on the Middle East where she used to live, and have to withstand that. And initially she didn't know why. It's like, why is this happening to me? Why do I get, it's horrible. And then it's like, I feel like I'm back there. Yeah. So it takes a lot to chip away. But if it's a more simple thing, it sounds simple, a noise, but it's what is the noise associated with? So one of the things, and anyone who can't resolve that, I suggest they get help to start to identify what noise means to them, what it's associated with, and what they're afraid of. Why is that causing that fear, anxiety? So if not, we can still work with it. They can do the breathing, the heart calming, because that puts the brain back online and helps rational thinking and not just emotional reaction. Every time they do that, they're releasing some of the trauma of that event in the autonomic nervous system. And that's powerful. So you slowly chip away. You're actually downloading the trauma through the nervous system instead of letting it sit there and grow. So that's, yeah. So there's a lot that people can do.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a question before we get any further. The person says, in the light of the impact of the pandemic, how do you see this in the context of post-traumatic stress?
Okay. There are people, I believe, who have post-traumatic stress because of the pandemic, children especially, and the isolation has been a big factor for people that they couldn't work, they were stuck at home, they couldn't even go and visit family, and that was highly traumatic for a lot of people, and there's still a carryover effect of that, where there's a fear it will happen again, and then if they're watching something that looks like that, or they hear that there might be a lockdown, they go into that panic and trauma again. So they're carrying that trauma. But the tools that we talked about from yesterday treat that level of trauma if the person applies it when they dial it up. I think there are lots of other fears that were traumatic. What was seen visually, if you watch some of the things, the images from China and different countries, and
Yeah.
and some of the riots and things going on. So there are a lot of traumatic events associated with the pandemic, and even now, what they're talking about, what they're going to do with the pandemic, or that we're going to have more pandemics, that becomes quite scary for people, and it just triggers that and adds to that trauma. It's yeah, because I mean, it's, you would know yourself how that affected you. It's the big aspect that is helpful. I find people who have belief, spiritual beliefs, and pray and practice what they preach, basically, and have a look at what the Bible teaches them, or contacting, talking to God, handing it over. That added into doing practical things like I do, or to help people with, is very powerful. And even research shows that people who have faith have much more resilience and aren't as impacted by these events as people who don't. So there is a lot of research on it now. So
Yeah, that's very true. I remember talking to my friend one time, and she was asking, because we have two kids, she was saying, what are you going to do? These lockdowns, and they are saying this, they're saying that. And I was talking to her, and I said, well, the Bible has predicted all these things. It says in the prophecies that these things are going to happen. I know how it's going to end. So she was saying, oh, I'm so glad you are so calm. And I'm not a calm person, but like when you mentioned the prophecies, like knowing the prophecies, know how this world ends, as you said as well,
and
it
God is
does
in
give a lot of
control.
comfort.
Yeah, because God is in control. And if you believe that, even though it looks like everything's out of control, I believe God's hand's over it. So that's very comforting for me. But not everyone believes that. So I find, depending on those sorts of beliefs you have, it's a very scary world at this time with the way things are going.
Yeah, exactly. So someone says, please say a prayer for me. We can pray for that person, of course. We'll keep you in our prayers. If we have a name, that will be better. We'll try to keep you in our
Person
prayers.
wants us to pray, we can, but I'm happy to pray for that person. She did have was it Angel something, because God knows who she is.
Yes. We can have a quick prayer, I guess, if we don't have to know what the issue is exactly. So you can have a prayer, Jenifer. Thank you.
Dear Father in heaven, we know that your presence is here, and we know that you love us all. And the person who is requesting prayer, we don't know the problems, but we know that you love that person and that you want to heal and reassure and be with them. So we pray for your presence, and that you will reassure the person who's requesting prayer that you love them and that you are there to help them. We thank you and praise you, and pray you'll be with us now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. And it is very good that people are requesting prayers and asking questions, because I found that the first couple of weeks we didn't have many questions. I feel that mental health is a bit of a taboo thing or embarrassing thing.
Yes.
So,
And we don't need to know names. People don't need to give us a name. If they have a question, please ask.
yeah, exactly. So we talked also a little bit yesterday about psychological and physiological depression. Jenifer, you also mentioned situational depression or associated with grief. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about the differences between those and maybe what tools you'll suggest to battle them?
The what we call like a biochemical depression is often referred to as endogenous, and then that is caused because the brain chemistry isn't working well. Either there isn't enough of the right chemicals in the brain, and well, I know the medical profession will target dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine are the main ones that they target, but there are lots of different chemicals in the brain, and those three relate to mood, particularly mobility, our body cycles. There's a lot more than one thing that those what they call neurotransmitters do. Sometimes the brain can't absorb it out of the system, when the blood's going through, because we can have a lot of serotonin, and the gut makes serotonin, and it's in the blood supply. So we can have a lot, but the brain's not absorbing it. So this is where medically they will use medication to try and get the brain to pick up those chemicals or to top up the brain. So if you see each cell as a tank, if the tank's a bit empty or dry, then the emptier it becomes, the more the person goes into what we call this endogenous depression. And I find that type of depression is worse than the situational, because the person knows the situation is the problem and they're feeling depressed. Whereas with the biochemical one, they will understand what I'm telling them, but they can't apply it. The brain is broken. I call it the broken brain syndrome. And so it's like it needs propping up. The medication is a crutch, and it helps prop the brain, but if they don't change anything else, then you take the medication away, they're going to fall over again. So medically what happens, like when I was working at this psychiatric clinic, we used to have the psychologist running programs to help rewire the brain, and the medication would pick them up enough to be able to then apply it and learn. And they found when they went home, they did really well. And they did things like exercise every morning, do things to help them sleep using more natural things like lavender or different herbal teas. So we taught them a lot that they could do to help themselves. And sometimes those people would come back in depressed again, and I'd say, oh, what happened? You were doing really well when you left. Oh, I stopped walking and I stopped doing, and then their relapse prevention plan went by the wayside, and they got stressed again. And of course, the brain chemistry dropped down. So it is very treatable, but you can't just, there's no magic pill that is going to treat the whole thing, because the brain's being programmed as well. When it's situational, an example would be depressed because you've lost a loved one or a pet, or somebody dies, and it's very traumatic, and we do a lot of grieving. So grief and loss is very much connected to situational depression. And depending how well a person grieves and moves through it and comes out the other side, then that will depend on whether they get over the depression. And I have met people who are still depressed, and it's gone on for years because of the loss of the husband or a child. And it's very sad, yet I've seen some people who've been treated and recovered really well, and they've lost 3 children in their life, so it just depends on the individual as to how well they deal with it. But getting them to go through the grief and loss process, as they come out, the depression starts to lift. So, and that's long term, because you don't just go a few weeks later, I'm fine now. Grieving when you're attached to someone and you love them takes a long time. But people can be depressed because they lost a job, or they couldn't find a job. So situations might seem minimal, but for that person, it's depressing. So if you've got health problems, it can be depressing. Pain problems are depressing. So it's very multifaceted. Also, I found that the way people deal with it, like there are people who've never been or not depressed in that way, and you get like people say, "Oh, my family tell me to snap out of it." What have I got to be depressed about? I've got family and friends. I've got a roof over my head or whatever. But that doesn't make any difference, because the depression is internal. It can be, if it's brain chemistry, that has to be rectified medically, usually, although there are some very good things you can do to help keep the brain chemistry thriving, and one of them is magnesium. Magnesium, we don't make magnesium. The body does not make it. We're reliant on it externally. That means food. So if you get a lot of people eating a lot of junk food, not having a good diet, not eating properly, not absorbing nutrients, then they're less likely to have enough magnesium. Males need about 400 milligrams in their system, not just a day, but it has to stay in the system to keep every cell healthy. Every cell has to have about 400 milligrams. Females around 300 milligrams. But what happens when you're stressed, you can lose 3, 4, 5 times of that daily dose of magnesium. So stress it's like it leaks out of the system rapidly. And unless you put it back in, you're in what we call a magnesium drought. And then it causes depression, because your brain chemistry needs magnesium. And they've done studies that show if you give a double dose of magnesium, so these were a group of women who they did 600 milligrams instead of the normal 300, and they found after 2 weeks, 80% of them were lifting out of the depression. So there's some very good natural things you can do to help depression, that being a key element. We don't absorb a lot of magnesium. Our soils are about 30% depleted of magnesium. And then if you buy your food on the shelf, supermarkets and that, again, you're looking at probably only, another depletion of another 30%. So you're really getting minimal. So I always recommend some form of supplement. One of the good supplement is using the magnesium chloride oil. It's highly absorbable, and it comes from the sea. If you go swimming in the ocean, you absorb magnesium, right? So there are things you can do, but this particular oil you can rub on. There are different mixtures of it. It's not a true oil, but it absorbs like an oil. And some of them can be very salty and a bit sticky. So if people out there bought those things, or they've got it and they go, "Oh, it's too sticky," just put a bit of water on the hand and dilute it down, and that will, or leave it on 20 minutes and wipe it off. But every cell, you get 100% absorption by putting it transdermally on the skin. Backs of legs are soft areas, around middle back. You can use it on pain areas. It helps to reduce pain. It's anti-inflammatory. It's got multiple benefits. So that's a key element most of my clients will use. And I get good feedback quite rapidly at how amazing it is and how much better they're feeling. It heals the nerves. It de-inflames the nervous system, and because your nerves have got what we call a nerve sheath on them, and when you're stressed for too long, over a long time, those sheaths are worn down. It's like taking the nail off the finger and you've got the quick exposed. You know how painful that is. That's what the nervous system is like. And so magnesium, putting it on like that, actually starts to de-inflame and heal the nervous system. It relaxes muscles. And this is why people who are low on magnesium get night cramps, muscle cramps, and restless leg syndrome. So Yeah. The next best form for absorption would then be powders you drink in liquids. The other one would be capsules. I use the veggie caps usually, powder in a capsule if you don't want to drink it. But tablets, you don't absorb much because the body has to break it down, process it, and go through the liver. So,
Yeah, I take magnesium citrate.
yes, that's absorbable.
Yeah, so they are in veggie caps and they are in powder form. I also have one that you can just mix and drink, which is not very palatable, but I've
Drink
tried
it
that
down
as
whole.
well. Yeah.
Uh,
So, yeah, that's good. I guess I've heard also, I know magnesium citrate works as well because there was a time when I didn't used to use any supplements. And then I went on magnesium because I used to have tension headaches.
oh, yes.
So that helped a lot. And I know that it helped because that was a time when I used to hold the kids a lot on the same side mostly. And so magnesium citrate, yeah, helped a lot. So I can,
Oh,
yeah.
good. Yeah. But it is, there's a lot we can do. Just a simple thing like that is a powerful remedy for mood as well as brain function, cell function. So that's sort of on the top of the list of needs that we don't get. And they estimate in studies about 80% of a Western population is magnesium deficient. They're in what's called a magnesium drought. So really, I think everyone should take it to be, and with stress, it's just inevitable where they're not getting enough.
So I have a family member that told me before that they are worried about just using supplements so freely. And magnesium, I know it's a water soluble mineral, so it doesn't, our bodies don't really retain it, and the excess is we just get rid of it. Is that right? We can't really overdose on it as such.
Okay, if you have too much magnesium, it loosens the bowel. That's a
Yeah.
sign to cut it back, and or it what they call reverses the symptoms. For example, I used to take it because I was getting a lot of night cramps, but I was also in a highly stressful environment over a long period of time, and I didn't know why. But when I found out that magnesium was the answer, I used a lot of it, particularly the transdermal one, and it was working really well. And after a period of time when I had less stress, I was getting night cramps again. And that's when I researched it further and found that it can actually reverse symptoms. So I realized I had to cut it back. When I cut it back, it was fine again. So we can actually regulate the dosage by those symptoms. There's a lot of very good information online about magnesium and supplements. So it's easy to research. So if people want to
Yeah.
know more, just Google it and have a look and see what's available. But that's a key
Yeah.
element I find. Yeah. Of course, good
That's right.
nutrition is another one. Yeah.
Yeah, so I use ashwagandha as well. So I
Yes,
don't know exactly how well it works, but I use it anyways.
okay. Oh,
Yeah.
well, people do, and you can do it in herbal teas. There's different ways of taking these nutrients. I encourage people to use lots of different forms of doing it because it's good. And I mean, the fresh foods, lots of greens, leafy greens. So working on absorbable nutrition, because one of the problems when you're stressed is your gut is inflamed, it's high, it's toxic, and you've got a lot of acid. And therefore, you can eat the best diet in the world and it won't translate because the gut won't absorb it. So this is where, and this is where I get people to do things when they're highly stressed, is like when you sit down to have a meal, I want you to do some breathing, do the heart focused breathing, get the heart rate right, the brain back online, and spend a little bit of time and focus and eat what we call mindfully, where you're focused and you're chewing and enjoying, and experiencing that instead of getting to the end of the meal and then someone says later on, oh, what do you have? Oh, I don't remember. How often we
Yeah.
hear, oh, I don't know I think I had lunch, so that's not good because the body won't utilize the nutrients. So we really need to slow down, and we're eating to live, not living to eat. Very important. And look,
Yeah.
God has given us so much beautiful foods and nutrients. even in because of the way things are going at this time, I've gone right into gardening and researching, and I'm fortunate living near a rainforest pocket, and there are about 30 edible foods in that rainforest. And so I've been doing my homework, and then weeds, there's a lot of highly nutritious weeds, more nutritious than what we buy off the shelf. So you
Yeah.
can, like, line's a prime example, and it's very good for the liver. So I think if we take an interest in our environment and what's available, we would never starve, not unless you kill
That's
everything.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
true. And working with your hands, working with the soil, that has proven to reduce depression as well. Yeah.
it does, and it's because it's got in certain, I think it's fulvic acid, and there's another one, I forget the name of it, that is in the soil that is really beneficial for us. And when you work with the soil, it absorbs into the system, and it helps helps a lot of things. So yeah. So
Yeah.
getting back to nature, I think, is very powerful. It's God given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the diet, not, I guess, relying on the supplements, but using them because, yeah, bearing in mind, I used to also, I take sometimes almonds for magnesium as well. Like if I have a headache, I take a handful of almonds. But like you said, at this day and age, we can't fully rely on just food or, yeah. So we talked about emotions, I guess, yesterday, feelings, and can we talk more about what aspect of that is controllable, what is not, what turns into character? Where should we start? Because we have read as well that the character is formed until you are 3 years old, and after that, it's very difficult to mold. So, what do you think about that? Do our feelings and emotions turn into our character? Where should we control? Yeah.
Well, when you look at things like fear and anger, they're very powerful emotions that often take us out of control. So, do our feelings rule us, or do we rule our feelings? And therefore, we have to work on having that self-discipline not to run on emotion. And we can't do that while the brain is out of balance. So what we have to do is the things I've been talking about in getting the physiological balance back. And one of the key elements of that is the heart. And, we often talk about matters of the heart, or is heartfelt, or have a heart. People, and biblically it talks about a stony heart and a heart of flesh. So we know
Yeah.
we can be cold-hearted, particularly if we're wounded or damaged. People could be born without that capacity, which is a bit scary, but that can happen. But for most people, when they're damaged, when they're wounded emotionally, they often shut the emotions down, and they actually feel, but they suppress them. So there's a lot of things we can do that affect the personality and how we manifest things. And then, of course, the media run on emotional hype. If you watch movies and, the dramas, the soap operas, things like that, it's all to do with getting our emotions going. So, and then games that children play, what we watch on TV. So we have to be careful. We've got to guard the emotions and protect them, and recognize the emotions are your barometer, and they tell us things aren't right or things are right. If we listen to our feelings, we make bad decisions. How often, like people who love to shop, how often have they gone into a shop and, it felt so good and I really need it, and get home and go, what did I buy that for? That was an emotional thing. Salespeople work on emotions, so it's about controlling. But unless we're aware of it, we get sucked into that vortex. So it's being in touch with your emotions, recognizing them. And this is what the EQ, emotional quotient, was about, was getting that balance back again. So to do that means that we need to do things in our mind, make sure we can think clearly and discern, I'm feeling like that, but I know I'm not to do that. Like I feel like telling that person off, but I know that's not a good thing, and you will withhold it and go away and process it and work out, well, maybe I just need to talk to them because it's upsetting me, versus yelling at them. And that's hard, because when you're used to impulsively reacting, we work on impulse. So, yeah, and I know all of us have to work with this. You know, I don't think there'd be one person on earth that hasn't had problems with emotional responses or lack of suppressed.
Oh my God.
Yeah, too much or too little. What's appropriate? We only know that when we're working in the present moment.
Yeah, exactly. So then by controlling our emotions, we can develop better character. Is that right? So they are connected.
Because what you do is you rewire the brain. And I know character building, biblically says it's a lifetime process. And when you look at how the brain works, and that it can actually cull and drop out neurons and put new ones in that build the character, till the day we die, the brain is changing. So we can work at it and improve. So are we going the wrong way or the right way? Is our character improving? Are we getting stronger and more resilient? And resilience we're not born with. We have to learn to be emotionally resilient and not, how many people personalize, take things to heart. There's that heart again, and, overreact to things. And then they're feeling hurt and angry over something that someone might have said that they didn't mean it the way the person took it. You see, so this is where it's learning to discern emotionally and check out what's really going on here. Okay,
Yeah.
and that means we've got to put in the right thinking. This comes back to changing the way we think and what we believe. See, if I believe something about a person and they say a certain thing, then I'm going to react. But is my belief correct? How often do we have wrong beliefs about something?
That's true. So you mentioned as well the shopkeepers, for example, or movies working on our emotions. What do you think about, like I've been recommended before, that, me and my husband maybe should sit down and watch love stories or romance or something. Do you actually think that watching someone else's relationship develop, or they love each other, they argue or whatever, does that really positively affect your own relationship?
Sometimes it can help. You might be learning something that they do that you think that's what we need to do more of. But I believe it's connecting, because often we have busy lives, and if you've got children, and a lot of people with children don't have quality time. And when I'm working with people on relationships, and particularly with families, often it's because the children are so consuming and they don't have the support they need from family or whatever, so they don't get quality time together. And by quality time, it's where you're really connected, you can talk heart to heart, and enjoy that time together alone, preferably alone. So it's planning and making time. And it doesn't have to be all the time. It doesn't have to be every day necessarily, but you need that connecting time. Once a week's good if you're both busy, and then come together and talk and catch up on what's been happening, but also affirming each other. And when you watch something on a program, it's not the same as sharing the love you have or talking to each other in a really caring way. And that goes a long way. It's having respect. It's the boundary systems we have. So,
Because I find that sometimes watching a love story, I used to watch more like secular love stories maybe, and that I found that it negatively affects my relationship, because maybe you start comparing, maybe you cry because something went wrong in their relationship. It's like, I'm not sure if it is personal or those movies actually do affect people negatively and we should stay away from them.
Well, what message is it giving you? And I work from, as far as my relationship with God goes, what is it He would want me to do? And do we really need to be watching fiction on the level that it touches the heartstrings and stirs the heart? And and now you have a look at what's happening now with all these movies, and that is all the thrill seekers, the adrenaline junkies, and children love to run on adrenaline, and therefore they're looking for that thrill and that excitement, which is emotional, but it's not reality. Life isn't like that. I mean, we have our highs and lows, but you're not learning to deal with it. So I think watching those sorts of things can be very damaging, and it's putting in belief systems that aren't always good for us, or expectations in a relationship, because it's the Hollywood romance principle. Can be an escapism because you're not happy with your own relationships. Therefore, it's like a surrogate relationship that isn't real. Yeah, this is where we've got to be careful as to what we do.
Yeah, very true. Thank you very much for that. So yesterday as well, Jenifer, we talked about the frontal lobe. You also spoke about different parts of the brain being responsible for different things, or logical thinking, or emotional thinking. Should we be focusing, as far as diet and exercise is concerned, should we be focusing on developing and working on our frontal lobe, or we should be focusing on certain parts of the brain?
Well, I think we need all health all round, muscles, bones, the whole lot. So, and exercise does that, and it helps the brain as well. But yes, there are nowadays, they've got what they call brain gym or brain exercises, and you go online and call them up. It's a use it or lose it principle. One of the best things for frontal lobe balance, because if you lose that balance, it means you're either going too emotional or too intellectual. So we have to have that balance. One of the best brain balances is doing things like jigsaw puzzles, because the brain, what it does, it can go, one side of the brain goes from bigger picture to smaller parts, and the other side goes smaller parts to bigger picture. And when you do a jigsaw, you look at the whole picture, then you look at all the bits and pieces, put it together. So it's exercising left-right brain and helps that wiring. So there are things that we can do. People do crosswords, Sudokus, and all sorts of things. But I just find like reading the Bible is amazing for the brain and the heart and the whole system. You know, if we have that spiritual element and then include the others, we're getting a whole workout, basically. Yeah, and we're given good instructions, and I believe we need to put God and Christ first in our life, because the rest will work out. It's when and this is why watching those fantasy things are not reality. It sidetracks us spiritually. Yeah, so it comes back to what are your priorities?
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned as well yesterday when you were talking that both IQ and EQ can be improved.
Yes.
And you gave us, some tools as well for that.
So,
So do you want to add a little bit to that, or?
Well, it is about the emotional balance. We can't risk one for the other. And if people are listening now that didn't watch the presentation I did last night, we talked about IQ being the inherent factor. So it means that it's genetic. We have a specific potential IQ. Whether we fulfill it or not depends on what we do with our brain and our mind, even nutritionally to the body and our attitudes. All of that affect IQ, but it's a set quotient, whereas it's like a barometer, whereas EQ, your emotional quotient, is about emotional balance, and it is learned. And it starts from conception to birth all the way through. And it has to do with what is called secure attachment, particularly in the womb with the mother, and all being well. If the mother's happy and balanced and nutritionally well, the child will thrive. When the child's born, it needs that attachment. It needs the mother to be able to read the emotional state of that child and help them regulate it. And by the age of 2, they need that secure attachment, because if it's insecure, then what happens, that child is like a ship without an anchor. And by the age of 2, we get the terrible 2s. They're insecure because they don't feel attached. And what they do is they go into control mode or chaos mode. So this is where you get these things happening where people are, by age of 2, the personality is developing, the character's developing, but it's not secure. Therefore, it goes to extremes. So you can get the balance back. And they found in research that even as an adult, if you have that insecure attachment, if you find it in a friend, and if you find that you feel attached to even your therapist or someone, but it's a healthy attachment. It might be a professional person. It might be other people in your life. What happens is it heals that insecurity. It heals that separation, and you start to reconnect and get emotional balance again. So there's more to that EQ factor, because we need to feel securely attached. And you look at how many people feel like they don't belong, they don't connect, or they've got major problems. This is where a lot of mental health problems and traumas issue from. So it's a huge area.
It is, yeah. It can definitely be expanded on in a whole different presentation.
Yes, yeah. But we can get that when we get emotional balance, we've got a good EQ. And emotional balance is a state of being where I'm now in balance the whole time. It means you can regulate your emotions. And this is where the early childhood principle is important, because the mother is your emotional regulator for the first 2 years. And if she can't do that because she's not in a good position, or she's struggling, or she's depressed or anxious, the child grows up not knowing how to self-regulate emotionally. But that's what the sort of work I do, is help people learn to do that, because the brain can program it. But it's like, if you're not taught it, you don't know. It's not until you learn something you go, oh, and the light bulb comes on, now I get it. Yeah. So this is what we call psychoeducation, teaching people about all of this. Often that's enough for people to do really well, because the brain goes, oh, now I understand, you see. So education's powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure a lot of people have light bulbs now, thinking that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we have an anonymous question, and the question is, what about intimacy? Does it help balance the emotions and hormones? Can it be a tool to help one or both partners feel better emotionally?
Well, intimacy comes from trusting people, trusting each other, feeling connected. If we can't easily trust, or we're feeling threatened, we can't have intimacy. So intimacy is something that develops. I mean, when you first meet someone, you don't go straight to intimacy. You get to know them, break the ice. When people share beliefs and values, then that can be a bit threatening, which is why they say don't talk about certain things like religion and politics, because if you've got different beliefs, it can create a lot of conflict. But that can be resolved. You can agree to disagree, for example. But intimacy comes about when two people are trusting each other, feel totally comfortable together and not threatened. It's that unity, which the Bible talks about, that the hearts come into unity, that we leave the family home and we come into unity. Well, that's oneness. So that intimacy is that oneness with that person, and that's where it becomes physical, mental, emotional, and I believe spiritual intimacy. And sadly, not a lot of people have it because they don't understand it, and they don't know how to work at it. So you can learn to have good intimacy in your relationship. And because I can see the question here, it will help balance both emotions and hormones, because your hormonal balance gets out of balance when we're stressed, anxious, have negative emotions. It impacts the hormonal system. So definitely emotional balance would help the hormonal balance as well.
And I've heard as well that intimacy without those emotional ties creates unhealthy ties. That if you don't share the same beliefs, if you don't share the same values, then it can create unhealthy ties that will cloud the reasoning. So you can't even make out whether you love the person or not. So
it becomes what we call conflict. So the conflict occurs when two people can't agree on something and believe that the other person should actually believe that too. So this is where we all have different beliefs. We come, and often opposites attract in relationships. So it's getting to know each other, and certain things we need to accept and resolve the conflict. So conflict resolution, I believe, is very important in a relationship. A conflict occurs, it separates you, it puts a brick in the wall. And if it's not resolved, the brick stays there, then we build another brick and another brick. So every time there's a conflict, so part of what I do to help people is look at what are the bricks in the wall and can they be resolved, and how can you do that? So that's very important, and it can make a big difference. So that means people have to be honest, stop taking things personally, being able to feel safe to share something. And sometimes they might feel safer when they've got a third party helping them with it. But I believe praying together, putting it before the Lord is another great aspect of growing, because it's really how our heart is, and God can heal a heart. So I think that's important.
Definitely. So we had this question come up before as well, Jenifer. What are your thoughts about actually avoiding negative people? Because we know they can affect us, they can affect our mental state, but is it wise or is it Christian-like to avoid them altogether, or there is another option?
Okay. Well, it depends really. If people are just constantly negative and their whole life is negative, then you don't want to be around them. And that's a hard one. But some people could be negative, but if you're a positive person, what you can do is actually do the opposite, is help them with their negativity, or being able to communicate with them and point it out, or show them the other side. We look at the pessimist and the optimist. So I'm an optimist, and sometimes people don't always like that because they want to be the pessimist. So there's a conflict. But I tend to look, as I say, on the bright side. So if someone's got a negative, I say, oh, why don't you see it this way, or why don't you do it that way? And that's partly what I do for my job, but I have to do it with me, and I try and do it with others. But I'm having to learn, well, no, that person just wants to be negative at the moment. Just let them do it and talk about it later. So it's that relationship factor. But it is hard to be with people who are constantly negative, and I have had relationships that have broken down, friendships, because it can start bringing you down, being in that atmosphere. So
so if you feel that it is affecting you, because I myself, I know I am affected if someone is negative, should we be avoiding that, or those people?
Well, it depends on how well you know them, doesn't it? I mean, if they're a friend of yours and you don't want to lose the friendship because there's better sides to it, being a true friend, you would find a way of talking to them and pointing it out. And there are ways we can do that. And this is where coming into some what we call those more assertive skills. But I find things like saving face, they call it, where you go, have you noticed? Or do you realise? Or I've noticed that. And they might say, oh, no, I haven't noticed, but they have. But it doesn't matter, because when you point it out in a gentle way, people are more likely to go, oh, maybe she's right, I've got to think about it. And you might have an example. And they might go, why do you think that? And you've got to have an example to go, well, the other day, or, I find whenever we get together, you tend to focus on these things. So finding things you can do and ways you can get that message across, and you work on the relationship. I mean, you can't make people change. You can only change the way you relate to them. The most powerful form of change is what I change in me to have a friendship or relationship, because I can't change them. And sometimes it doesn't work. If they're very negative, they mightn't like it and might just back off and go away. As long as you do it the right way, do it with love and care.
Yeah, our response mainly.
And you're thinking of the other person, not just yourself. This is where we need to be other-centered, not just self-centered. Negativity is often tied to self.
True. So we had another question that again is anonymous. So the question, so it says that their friend frequently is hearing voices and conversations that have been happening to her or him for 40 years plus. The manifestations can cause distress, and yet at other times they seem to be under control. What's causing the situation? That has caused my friend to withdraw from social interaction to a large extent. So, what steps could be taken for healing and resolution? And when I asked what they mean exactly, it is uncertain as to what the voices are. The person also says the voices often torment the person, and yet they seem to abate when the person is in company with other people.
When they're distracted, they're focused elsewhere. So yeah, so it's very self-focused for the voices because they're locked in their head, hearing what's going on. There's probably a number of aspects to this because our brain some people's brains actually hear it more in that verbal sense. Other people might get just an impression of something, but some people are actually hear it in a more auditory way. But there are different thoughts. I mean, if that person went to a psychiatrist for an assessment, they could well be labelled with something like schizophrenia or having a psychotic episode, because that's when people hear voices. Often they believe the voices are coming from somewhere or something, but they can certainly be in their head. Sometimes it can be due to trauma. They've had initial trauma, and I have a client that I've got several clients actually where that can happen because they go into what we call a dissociative state, which takes them back to a segment of their childhood. The personality becomes fragmented, and so they have these different fragments talking to them, and yet they know that there's no one doing that it's in their head. But this is where the brain has developed in that way. The other aspect of that is the spiritual side, because that there are what we call demonic forces or evil forces that can take over or impress minds. So and if the person considers that or thinks that's a problem, this is where having a pastoral visit or finding someone who understands that and helps them with it. For some people, and I've known someone who found that having an anointing and prayer with them was very powerful in stopping that. So there are different aspects that need to be looked at that can help that person. So I'm hoping some of that would be helpful.
Definitely. And also, let's just talk a little bit about the New Age techniques. You touched a little bit on that yesterday as well. Jenifer, you talked about, Christians and the Eastern philosophy, perhaps. So what's wrong with, for example, practicing yoga for a Christian? We've had this question before as well. So
it comes back to philosophy, because Eastern meditation has an opposing philosophy, or Eastern practices have an opposing philosophy to Christianity. So if you're a Christian, you have certain beliefs that are in conflict to those types of practices. Therefore, I believe it's best not to do them. Yet at the same time, something like yoga, the stretching exercises are excellent. The breathing really helps, but there are other ways you can do that. So it comes back to looking at what is the philosophy of those practices, and is that a good philosophy? Does it fit in with my philosophy? And certainly as a Christian, you can only say no. And the Bible does have things to say about being involved in those sorts of practices, and it actually outlines them and lists them, so we can be discerning. I came out of New Age beliefs and thinking. I sort of went into the world for a few years, from teens through to probably late 20s, early 30s, but up to late 20s, where I was using these practices because they can be spiritually connected, because we've got to realize that we have the spiritual side with God and God's love, but there's also an opposing factor there with spiritual practices that can come in a way that seems right but isn't right. And it makes you feel good. I find it's the feel good principle. Is it because it's right I'm feeling good, or is the feeling taking control? One of the things this was years ago, back in the 60s and 70s, we'd refer to them as bliss bunnies, because I always want to be on a high and living on that blissful level. And I don't believe that's reality, because life dishes out all sorts of things. So we're not always going to be in that state. So, and people do these practices for different reasons. And also, what is happening to the mind? Like, because the mind constantly thinks, it never stops thinking. Even when you go to sleep, your subconscious is more active than your consciousness during the day. And when they monitor you in your sleep state, you're doing the subconscious brain, which is that deeper emotional brain we talked about. That second brain is doing overtime, trying to sort out the garbage pit and the stress for the day and doing that. And then when we wake up, we put a lid on it and put it back down again. But that type of activity is normal, that we must not stop the brain. So this thing of like to do a meditation, empty the mind, is not a reality. We're always thinking, and it's impossible to do. But when you start doing that sort of thing, where you go into a state of relaxation, what it can do is actually cause a separation, where you have that experience that it can be euphoric, but also separation of self. It's not unity, whereas for me now meditation is with God, and it's a totally fulfilling, unified experience. I feel connected, not disconnected. So can't empty the brain, and it's actually a form of self-hypnosis, some of those practices, which is not good for us. So it comes back to discerning and working it out, looking at what you do, and always check out. And I hear these things, because, I found this great thing and it's really good and it's this and it's that. And when I go and research it, it actually comes from a very new age philosophy, or things that I think, well, I know it sounds good, might be working on vibrations or different things that I know aren't necessarily healthy. And that's from my experience, not just from what I've read. So it's being discerned.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And also, if anyone thinks that it's just breathing and stretching, it's not. Yeah, like you said, it's not the case, because my dad himself, before I believe he became a Christian, he used to do yoga, and he said that he got to a certain level where he actually experienced his body being separated from, it's like he saw himself from above, and he got very scared. So he can definitely testify to that it's not just physical stretching or breathing exercises.
Well, it's not. And a lot of people share those experiences. And I know I've had some of those as well when I used to do those practices. I started life as a very young age and really accepted Jesus and loved God, but I got lost along the way, because I didn't have the support and the anchoring I needed, or understanding. I understood God, but I didn't understand that there was other forces, evil forces, that could mimic it or represent it. So I got very caught up. But I don't regret that, because it's helped me to be discerning now that I've come back to God and that truth and study the word, and the power of that is far greater than anything I experienced back there. But it also has helped me to see how this is affecting a lot of people, and it permeates magazines, our practices. If you have a look, the majority of the world, movies and that, are caught up in these philosophies, and I don't believe they're going to give us that fulfillment from my experience that I get with a direct relationship with God. It's
yes, very true. And like you said as well, there are other ways. If we just want to do some part of that, there are other ways that we can do these breathing exercises and stretching.
Yes, and just walking, and I do stretching exercises, and I find they're great in the morning. And one of the things I learned, that because I've got cats, but if you watch cats, what's the first thing they do when they wake up? They do a huge arched stretch. So the cats and I do our stretching in the morning, and it doesn't take a lot for the blood to get going, the lungs to open up, and you feel so much better. And everyone can do that. Even if you've got pain, there are still certain parts of the body that you can stretch. whether it be the fingers, the toes, or, so I help people find their comfort zone and to do things like that, because it gets oxygen in, gets blood flow going, gets the brain going. So, and often with pain, people immobilize because they don't want the pain, and what they're doing is making it worse instead of better. So it's
True.
So there's a lot you can do.
Yeah. So we have another question. In the world of psychology, mindfulness is gaining momentum as distress technique. Any comments about that?
There are a number of practices around in psychology. In fact, it's mainstream psychology that teaches mindfulness, but the mindfulness they're talking about is the Buddhist way of mindfulness, and they actually use the Buddhist meditations and teachings. This is one of the reasons I work solo now, because I didn't want to use those practices working for a system or a health system. But I believe true mindfulness is what we talked about yesterday, where people could actually stay focused in the present, connected to God, in living that life where they're appreciating everything on a daily basis. That's what mindfulness is, but it's choosing what practice do I want to be mindful. It's making an informed choice, because mindfulness has become very new age. It's a new age connection, which we've talked about, which is really bringing the Eastern philosophies in, which is in opposition to what I understand from God and as a Christian. So it comes back to there's only those two sides. But I get people to ask questions. It's still a personal choice. So if you're going to see someone and find out what their practices are, what do they believe? Where does it come from? Do your homework and then make a decision.
So, Jenifer, what do you think about medications for anxiety, depression? You mentioned something about it can kind of help the person. It can pick them up a little bit so that they can exercise maybe and gain control of their lives. Are you completely opposed to that, or there is a place and time that we can use medications?
I can only say that I have had people that I've worked with or seen, and there are very much a minority that are so down and they cannot pick themselves up. They're the point where they are totally suicidal, and that is a daily way of life. And I would rather them try some medication and then work with the sort of practices we're talking about but the medication becomes an interim, not a way of life. And unfortunately, now a lot of people work with medication in the wrong way because it's too hard to get off, or they don't know, they haven't learned anything else. And unfortunately, what a lot of these medications do, they actually cause a crutch for the brain. Now, an example of a crutch is when you damage your leg and you've got a cast on it or one of those boots and you're on a crutch. Or when you might be doing that for 6 weeks, then when you take the cast off, what's the leg looking like? If you compare it to the one you've been using, it's weak, it's lost muscle tone. And if you put your foot down and put your weight on it, you're going to fall over. And this is what happens with the brain. With those medications, whatever the brain is doing that is working, even though it's not working as well as it could, stops working and relies on the crutch. So if you don't do anything else and pick up the brain, and this is what I do, is get people's brain function going, not just with learning, but with magnesium, and I use some other supplements like you were talking about, the brain ones that we can use, the Astra, I never say the name, Astra, yes, something like that, and get people to do things to pack in lots of nutrients, because often they're not eating properly and the brain is starving. So what you do is you get the brain, pick it up, and they start to feel good naturally because they're walking, they're doing things, they're eating well, they're taking supplements. Then the doctor says, well, look, you're doing well. And if they do that over a certain time, they start weaning them off the medication. And then if they're still working with me, there's a few things that I will help them put in, get them to increase magnesium, a few other supplements we work with for the brain, and help them to pick up again. So that way they do a transition. So as the crutch or the medication's being taken away, they can keep that momentum going, and we then work in maintenance. So they don't, and I believe if you've had a depressive episode and you're on medication, then if you do it that way, that you will not have to go back to medication. Sleep is an essential. That's one of the big problems when your brain chemistry is not right, or your body's not right, and even psychologically we can have insomnia and not sleep well, and that is a major player in recovery. So getting people into a good sleep cycle is essential in that recovery. So, and as you recover, you sleep better anyway, so it's sort of a bit like a dog chasing its tail, but finding that way of breaking it and breaking that pattern.
Yeah, definitely. So what about you touched obviously, Jenifer, on emotions, on our feelings. Is there a time where anger, well, resentment, obviously it's not a good feeling or emotion, but is there a time where these negative emotions that are perceived by us as negative, that are useful, let's say anger or fear?
Okay. Well, I mean, anger is actually, it's not a forbidden thing, but it's appropriate at a given time. And even biblically, there are certain points where Christ was angry because of what they were in the temple, because of what they were doing to his father's house. So there's appropriate anger, but there's inappropriate anger. We're told not to go to bed if we're angry. If you've got wrath, and make sure you resolve it before you go to bed. And if you don't, you're going to have insomnia a lot of the time, when you look at it practically. But it's discerning, because anger is a protective mechanism. It's actually a volatile energy that protects us. So if someone comes up and threatens me, my anger is going to, because it's adrenaline driven, is a way of fighting back or getting that person away from me, or getting away from that person. So it comes back to what's appropriate. But unfortunately, in our society, we have a lot of anger because we're hurt, we're angry, we can't resolve things. The way the system's going, we get angry and we carry that anger, and that's very, very counterproductive. It really brings your health down, particularly your mental health. So, But there are other emotions, like sadness is a classic, because it's normal to feel sad when you lose something. We talked about grief and loss, and that person has to accept they're going to feel sad probably for a long time. And they might start picking up, but then they'll see something that reminds them of the loss, and they're going to feel sad for a while. So it comes back to being able to look at what we see as negative. We need to sometimes sit with that. For example, if I've done something that's offended someone, even, and it's not necessarily you mean to do it, you do it in inadvertent ways, and they're not happy, and they're feeling hurt and maybe angry with you, you're going to feel guilty. You might feel shame. And until you resolve it or you work with that person, that will sit there, because guilt is a way of telling us we've done something wrong. So it's not a bad thing, but we can have appropriate guilt where we become guilty for everything when it's not appropriate. And that is a problem, a mental health problem within itself, guilt-ridden people. Is it false guilt or is it true guilt? And if it is, what can you do about it? So you can see how a negative emotion can also be a positive, guilt being an example.
Yeah, so we shouldn't get rid of them, but we should balance them, and we should, I guess, ask ourselves the question, what can we do about it? If we are guilty, resolve it.
Well, see, this is where you're now talking about brain balance, because the only way you can step back and question it is turn back the left brain, the thinking brain, because the emotion consumes, and we get caught in that right brain. Emotional focus goes straight into our emotional memory bank, and all the times we've done wrong things and we feel guilty, we bring it up and load it into the present. And often about 90% of an emotional reaction in the present is from the past. It's what I call a loaded gun. We drag it up and we don't know. We don't go, oh, that's because 6 years ago I felt this way. And we don't do that. We've loaded it into that emotional brain, and then there's the trigger happens and we suddenly have excessive guilt about something that was a trivial thing, right? So that's an example. And then we have to be able to step back from it and go, hang on, why am I feeling so guilty? So that means we've now we're looking at it, we're not just caught in it. So it's like you have to observe the emotion. And the way you talk to yourself, like with anxiety, instead of going, oh, I'm so anxious, because anxiety is in the body. It's very physical. If I go, oh, my body's really anxious today, what's the problem? That means I've got too much adrenaline, too much cortisol. So other emotions are the same. It's a physiological process. We can't separate the brain and the body. And emotions are a matter of the heart. It is an emotional center. They're finding the heart is the emotional center. It's actually highly intelligent. It doesn't just pump blood around the body. It actually has a brain system, and it is more powerful than the mind, our brain. So it is the seat, of what we need to deal with. So the brain processes, but this is where the feelings hit. So when you get hurt, where does it hit? Here. That's why we go, oh no, I'm feeling hurt. And yet we go up here to try and fix it, but we have to take into account the whole system.
True. Very good. I'm sure we could talk about a lot more things. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We want to thank you so much, Jenifer, for sharing and for the wonderful facts that you had for us.
Well, God's given me a lot of good things, and I do like to share. I believe that's what He wants us to help each other. So what better way to do it?
Yeah, that's right. And we're hoping that we can have you back again sometime in the future.
I'd love to.
Because we have a lot of questions about mental health, and it is very important. So
it is.
If we can ask you to close with a word of prayer.
Love to. Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the wonderful blessings you've given us. And even though I can't meet people out there, I know that what I've learned and understand and practical ways are helpful. So please help each one of us to change the way we think, to change our brain and change our heart and to positives, and help us, Lord, to grow and to heal, because we all have hurt, we have pain. And we know, Lord, that you can heal anything. So we pray you'll be with us now. Your Holy Spirit will lead us and guide us and help us to change in the right way and be ready for when you return. We thank you and praise you. In Jesus' loving name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much again, Jenifer. God bless you, and we will hopefully see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye, and goodbye to anyone who's been listening. It was
yes, thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us. Thank you for your participation as well. We have a lot more questions, and we welcome all questions in the future. Jenifer is very busy, so she can't herself answer your emails, and she can't respond to all emails, but she's happy to work through us. And if you can email us if you have any questions for her and for other presenters, email us on takechargeofyourhealth101@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to address those questions to her. So reminding everyone that you can again email and request for the handouts, and we'll be happy to send them to you. You can also watch more from Jenifer Skues on YouTube. One of the series is called Healthy Mind, Happy Body, and Stress Management. You can also hopefully find more of her presentations on 3ABN on their website, because that's how we got to know about Jenifer Skues. To make most of our channel and to be notified of all upcoming videos, presentations, and meetings, consider joining our online community by subscribing, sharing, and liking. Yeah, share with everyone who you think will benefit from this presentation. So, like we said, in October we will have another mental health month. So watch out for that. Thank you very much, everyone, and God bless. We will see you next time. Bye for now.